Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, the brief and tragic reign of Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico. Now let's get started with our story about Maximilian I. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States, through sale, annexation, or warfare, had obtained control of over 750,000 square miles of land that was formerly either part of or controlled by the country of Mexico. This landmass was delineated by present-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, much of California, Nevada, Utah, and part of western Colorado. While this development was deeply resented by the various Mexican governments that were forced to agree to such an outcome, it was also looked upon with concern by the European powers. Mexico, until 1821, was a Spanish crown colony for 300 years after its conquest by the conquistador Hernán Cortés. The next 30 years provided chaos and political conflict, typically between wealthy conservative elements of Mexican society and their more liberal populist and secular opponents. In January of 1861, these liberal military forces concluded a 3-year civil war by defeating their conservative rivals and reestablishing a central government in Mexico City, led by Benito Juárez. This government also refused to honor debts incurred by loans to previous conservative entities owed to various Western European financial institutions. With the U.S. government embroiled in a civil war, France, Spain, and Great Britain viewed these loans as the perfect pretext to launch an actual military invasion of Mexico, a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine. But French ruler Napoleon III had much more ambitious plans other than mere debt collection. Not only did he intend to invade Mexico, he also wished to install a monarchist government and veritable French colony, a further expansion of his ongoing imperialist vision. Not wanting any part of such a venture, the British and also the Spanish eventually withdrew, negotiating financial agreements on their own. It took approximately a year, but in June of 1863, French forces and their various Mexican allies, mostly conservative monarchists, entered Mexico City, consigning the Juárez government to various distant provinces. Intent on proclaiming a legitimate monarchy and not wanting to involve any nationals from the 3 European powers involved, eventually, it was decided to offer the newly created throne of Mexico to the Archduke Maximilian of Austria. The younger brother of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, this member of the Habsburg dynasty was a relatively respectable figure, and for various reasons, he accepted this post. Like something out of a fairy tale, the Archduke and his wife Charlotte, having recently adopted the more Hispanic Carlotta, a daughter of Belgian King Leopold I, first set foot on Mexican soil at Veracruz on May 29, 1864. Thus began the brief and tragic reign of Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico. The Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian was born on July 6, 1832, at Schönbrunn Palace on the outskirts of Vienna, the Austrian Empire's equivalent of Versailles. His first name was an honorary tribute to his uncle, the Emperor Ferdinand I, and his second name, which was typically used, was an acknowledgement of his maternal grandfather, Maximilian Joseph, King of Bavaria. His mother, Princess Sophie of Bavaria, was the daughter of Maximilian Joseph, a member of the House of Wittelsbach, the ruling dynasty of Bavaria for over 800 years. Both contemporary and historical gossip speculated that the Archduke Maximilian may have been the illegitimate child of Sophie and the Duke of Reichstadt, also known as Napoleon II, the son of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Duke essentially lived in exile at Schönbrunn. The Austrian government determined that no element of the French military or government could resuscitate Napoleonic rule by restoring the Duke of Reichstadt to power. Sophie from Bavaria and the Duke were similar in age, and both felt out of sorts in the stodgy, rigid Austrian royal court, dominated by conservatism and protocol. Ambitious, intelligent, and well-read, Sophie found a kindred spirit in the Duke of Reichstadt, as opposed to her husband, the Archduke Franz Karl, a typically shallow, dim-witted European autocrat. Although Sophie socialized a great deal with the French exile, the fact that she had 3 more children after the Duke of Reichstadt's untimely death in 1832, and the fact that she treated him more like a son than a brother indicates that the rumor of Maximilian's illegitimacy was nothing more than malicious gossip. Although in early childhood Maximilian was quite close to his older brother Franz Joseph, eventually competitiveness created a rift between the two as they grew up. Both spent a great deal of time receiving a classical education, and Maximilian, more intelligent and engaging than his dense and introverted older brother, frequently attempted to demonstrate his superior proficiency in both scholarly and athletic pursuits. Much of this mentality stemmed from Franz Josef's status as the older of the two, and the heir apparent and future emperor. Maximilian strived to be perceived as also relevant, behavior which only irritated his brother. Franz Josef became enthusiastic about all aspects of the military, while Maximilian was more interested in the royal zoo at Schönbrunn and the exotic plants in the palace greenhouses. Military parades he found utterly boring. His mother Sophie's attempt to instill a love of literature and culture in her sons, going so far as to having contemporary writers like Hans Christian Andersen personally reading to her children, seems to have resonated more with Maximilian, Franz Josef preferring less cerebral pursuits like hunting and fishing. As they reached adulthood, the two brothers exhibited 2 very distinct personalities. Although he was in line for the Austrian throne, initially it was perceived that it would be decades before Franz Josef assumed the throne. His uncle Ferdinand was only 42 when he was crowned in 1835. His father, Franz Karl, Ferdinand's heir apparent, was only 33. But Ferdinand was a serious epileptic who could not even consummate his own marriage, much less sire children, and events sweeping the European continent would also diminish the prospect of Franz Karl ever becoming the emperor. Because of Ferdinand's infirmities, a council of nobles, including Franz Karl, was the official governing body of the Austrian Empire. In reality, this council was dominated by the repressive Clemens von Metternich, a prominent Austrian court diplomat and politician whose intrigues with other monarchical European governments served to impose an authoritarian political structure across the continent. For over 3 decades, post-Napoleonic Europe enjoyed relative peace, albeit orchestrated by censorship, political arrest, and military intervention. In 1848, the reactionary political environment in Europe was demolished by spontaneous popular revolutions across the continent, which began in France in February and ousted the French king Louis Philippe. This mentality prompted unrest in Hungary, considered a fundamental part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but racked by Hungarian nationalism. A general chaos led to a popular insurrection in Vienna that actually forced Austrian royalty to flee the capital for Innsbruck. Franz Josef was already serving in the military in the Austrian province of Venice, and his image was burnished by this service, as opposed to Ferdinand and Franz Karl, who were perceived as utterly ineffectual. Fortunately, the army remained loyal to the monarchy. Behind the scenes, the ambitious Sophie engineered agreement between the nobility, government, and military to demand Ferdinand's abdication, and also induced her husband to renounce his claim to the throne. Popular demands for the ouster of Metternich were satisfied with the diplomat's resignation and exile to Great Britain. Sophie believed that her 18-year-old son would not be perceived as negatively as the older members of the monarchy, and with Franz Josef's coronation on December 2, 1848, order was restored in Vienna and the surrounding provinces, frequently through military force and political arrest and occasionally execution. Sophie's machinations were also shrewd in that promises to provide a constitutional form of government were made by Ferdinand and not the newly crowned emperor, who could conveniently ignore such promises. However, the Austrian Empire still faced unrest in the Italian and Hungarian regions of the kingdom. Northern Italy was still a completely disorganized group of Austrian provinces, grand duchies, and independent nation-states that were intent on achieving independence from Austria. Hungary was also a hotbed of nationalism, determined to separate from Austrian imperial rule. Franz Josef first subdued the Italian threat via military invasion, opposed by a ragtag group headed by the King of Sardinia, who ultimately surrendered and immediately fled to Portugal. Hungary took a bit more force, and Austria invited Imperial Russia to co-invade, the reactionary Tsar Nicholas I happily providing over 200,000 troops to help destroy budding Hungarian nationalism. Instead of democratic reform and a national identity, Hungary remained part of the Austrian Empire, subject to direct Austrian martial law. Although still too young to assume any formal position in the Austrian government, Maximilian was keenly aware of his brother's role in the Austrian government hierarchy's attempt to brutally repress liberalism and renege on any promises of constitutional government. Maximilian was also quite vocal about these beliefs, and his visibility and popularity among the intellectual elite of Vienna was a sharp contrast to the outlook of the emperor, considered to be a reactionary relic attempting to resist inevitable political change. Maximilian's candor only reinforced his brother and others within the government's attitude that the Archduke was to be isolated from any position of potential political power. Through territorial concessions granted after the Napoleonic collapse, Austria was in possession of the province of Lombardy, Venetia, which included the port of Venice and the Venetian fleet, ultimately reconstituted as the Austrian Navy. Maximilian was assigned to a position within this unit, which was headquartered in Trieste, a posting outside of any influence at the Viennese court. Maximilian assumed a diplomatic role as well as that of a naval officer, embarking on voyages throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, a role he enjoyed but which kept him far, far away from any political influence. Although considered something of a farce, the Austrian Navy was modernized by Maximilian's ability to exact funding from his brother, and in 1854 his efforts were recognized by his appointment as commander-in-chief of the fleet. Understanding that he was most likely to spend a great deal of time in Trieste, he designed and constructed an impressive palace on the Adriatic, an ocean view residence he named Miramar. Most of his official efforts focused on diplomatic visits across Europe and meetings with various heads of state. In May of 1856, one of these ventures resulted in Maximilian meeting with the Emperor of France, Napoleon III. A unique political figure in his own right, Napoleon III was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. After several failed coup attempts against the French monarchy, in 1848, Napoleon III, then known as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was democratically elected the first president of France. Seizing on imperial nostalgia and through various referendums and machinations, he eventually proclaimed the Second French Empire and himself in 1852 the Emperor, Napoleon III. Maximilian's 1856 interaction with this newly created emperor was cordial and positive, an event that eventually had major consequences for the Austrian Archduke. At the request of Franz Josef, Maximilian next traveled to Belgium, a newly created sovereign nation, concocted by the great powers of Europe, mostly to keep it from falling under control of the French. Its king, Leopold, formerly a hand-picked minor duke of a tiny German principality, was not particularly impressive. But Maximilian was impressed by Leopold's youngest daughter, 16-year-old Princess Charlotte. Well-educated, intellectual, and ambitious, she was also considered among the most beautiful and eligible women of European royalty, having already rejected 2 formal engagement requests. Unlike her other suitors, Charlotte was immediately attracted to Maximilian, who was similar in both his intellect and adventurous personality. After a year-long courtship, Maximilian and Charlotte were married on July 27, 1857, in Brussels. The groom was 25, the bride 17, young by today's standards, but typical of unions involving European royalty. Wanting the union to appear as prestigious as possible, during the prenuptial negotiations between Leopold I and Franz Josef, the Belgian king requested that his new son-in-law be granted a formal title of authority. The Austrian emperor agreed, naming Maximilian the governor of the Austrian province of Lombardy-Venetia. On its surface, such an appointment, ruling over a prominent region of the empire, would seem a prestigious step up for the Archduke. But underlying issues made the position a mixed bag at best. During the uprising of 1848 and 49, the Austrian military brutally cracked down on the province's nationalist Italians, behavior that permanently alienated the inhabitants and imbued them with a deep hostility. Despite Maximilian's public image as more enlightened than the emperor, he was still viewed as an agent of a hated imperial regime. Fully aware of this public perception, Maximilian personally tried to alter local attitudes and personally interact with his subjects. He spoke of loosening imperial authority, instituting a provincial senate, and beneficial economic reforms. Of course, Franz Josef scoffed at such reforms, indicating that the Archduke had lost sight of the best interests of Austria, and he even demanded that Maximilian be even more repressive. This difference of opinion was underlined by an incident that had an immediate impact on Maximilian's governmental status. On January 14, 1858, in Paris, an Italian nationalist and revolutionary, Felice Orsini, attempted to assassinate Napoleon III while the emperor was en route to the opera. 3 bombs were hurled at the emperor's carriage, killing 8 and wounding over 100 people. Orsini meant to incite a French revolution, which he hoped would also precipitate an Italian uprising. His trial and execution transformed him into a martyr, and public demonstrations quickly erupted through Lombardy-Venetia, and, unsatisfied with Maximilian's diplomatic attempts to reason with the protesters, Franz Josef relieved the Archduke and replaced him with a military governor. The subsequent arrests and repression only inflamed the situation, and surprisingly, Napoleon III secretly offered 200,000 troops to an Italian coalition to jointly oppose the Austrian occupation of Italian territory. This alliance eventually resulted in the decisive June 24, 1859, Battle of Solferino, a small town in northern Italy. With both the French and Austrian emperors on the battlefield, over 200,000 soldiers fought an extended battle that resulted in almost 40,000 casualties, the costliest European engagement since the Napoleonic era, with greater human loss than what occurred at Waterloo. considered a tactical victory for the French and Italian forces based on the dreadful carnage, Napoleon III asked for a ceasefire and signed an armistice after personally meeting with Franz Josef on July 11th. Because Napoleon III was eager to end hostilities and prevent the war from spreading to the rest of Europe, his terms were relatively lenient. Still, Austria was humiliated, having lost every consequential battle during the 2-month conflict, and was forced to officially cede Lombardy to the Kingdom of Sardinia. Various other Italian states also eventually unified, emerging from Austrian control and damaging Austria's image as an influential European power. Maximilian was personally mortified by both his brother's failure and his own lack of any official responsibility. He spent most of his time at his residence at Miramar. Franz Josef's deemed incompetence forced him to accept constitutional constraints, another degradation of the Habsburg dynasty. This development made any interaction with Maximilian's immediate family difficult, his mother and ruling brother's perception of him as similar to the rabble now demanding populist reform. The relationship grew personally hostile. Franz Josef's wife, the Empress Elizabeth, considered Charlotte unworthy and was frequently nasty and dismissive. The Empress, a singularly difficult and headstrong personality to begin with. The time period immediately after the disastrous Italian campaign was for both Maximilian and Charlotte frustrating and depressing. They sensed that they might spend the rest of their lives consigned to their lovely but distant palace in Trieste, with nothing to contemplate other than the view of the Adriatic. Unbeknownst to Maximilian and his wife, efforts regarding the country of Mexico and individuals intent on establishing a monarchy in this Central American territory were independently developing. These individuals included a cadre of former conservative Mexican government officials now in exile in Paris, and Napoleon III, who considered Mexico an appropriate location to continue his goal of French imperial expansion, the country both rich in natural resources and potentially strategically important to blunt American regional expansion. Many of the great European powers were already concerned by the United States' meteoric regional dominance and rapid territorial growth. From this concern came the possibility of installing a European monarch as a newly created royal entity in Mexico. This was a fairly common practice in Europe, with Charlotte's father the beneficiary of such an installation in Belgium, and Greece also had a similar monarch installed, only 2 of several such situations imposed by the European powers. Just who to install and how this process could be enabled in Mexico were the fundamental challenges of this intrigue. Maximilian was a fairly obvious choice, from a prominent dynasty, a Catholic, and also possibly willing to agree to such an undertaking, with few other options at the moment. For the Mexican monarchists in Paris, they believed the first step in sounding out the Austrian Archduke would be to see if he even had any interest. The head of this delegation, José Gutiérrez de Estrada, sent a formal letter to the Austrian ambassador to France, suggesting that Mexico needed a monarchy to flourish, and also to inquire about Maximilian's potential interest in this position. This communication was immediately forwarded to the Austrian foreign minister, Count Johann von Rechberg. The Austrian foreign minister, on his own, decided that such a venture was at best a pipe dream, but he did not wish to permanently close off any possibilities. He responded that the Habsburgs and Austria would be generally honored at such a proposition, but would of course require the military support and endorsement of especially Britain, France, and Spain. By the fall of 1861, Napoleon III's belief that the American Civil War would be a lengthy affair seemed like a prescient analysis. Already having discussed the Mexican situation with the monarchist émigrés on numerous occasions, he also had discussions with the Austrian Foreign Ministry in an attempt to accelerate his general plan. Although vague in specifics, he did agree to diplomatically support a Habsburg on the Mexican throne, and also gave assurances that Spain, and most importantly Britain, would also be supportive. It was at this point that Austrian Minister Rechberg felt it appropriate to involve the Emperor Franz Joseph, realizing again that this might be an opportunity to occupy his brother in a distant capacity, far away from Vienna, solving two fundamental dynastic concerns. He told Rechberg to head to Miramar and to talk to Maximilian directly. Predictably, both Maximilian and his wife were initially very enthusiastic about such an offer. Charlotte's father, King Leopold, was also supportive, probably understanding that his son-in-law faced an uncertain future in Europe at best. Minister Rechberg returned to the Mexican delegation with the news that indeed Maximilian was interested in such a proposition. He did add two stipulations: one, that France and Great Britain must sign a military alliance protecting the Mexican government, and two, that the Mexican people must approve his rule through a popular referendum. These were not insignificant demands, but Napoleon III essentially decided that he now had an appropriate candidate, and he would deal with these other issues later. In concert with the Mexican delegation, the French emperor resolved to personally involve himself in the recruitment of Maximilian. He sent letters to the Austrian delegation, knowing that Maximilian would see them, indicating his personal knowledge of great popular support for the monarchy in Mexico, that upon the advent of such royalty, the people would rise in revolt against the current government. He also unofficially hinted that the British government was also supportive of this Mexican venture, but both of these assertions were untrue. Napoleon III had discussed the matter directly with the British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston. To bait the hook, the French emperor discussed the mutual desire to force Mexico to pay back its European debts, and he also floated the idea of the installation of a European-style monarchy in Mexico, supported by both France and Britain as a check on the United States. Palmerston was on board with forcibly getting money repaid, but he specifically wanted no part of a military overthrow of the current Mexican government, recognizing both the cost and potential challenges to imposing a monarchy in such a distant location. On October 31st, 1861, France, Great Britain, and Spain signed the Convention of 1861, which authorized a military expedition to force Mexico to repay its debt. However, this agreement, as demanded by Great Britain, explicitly stated that interference in Mexican politics was forbidden, and this certainly included what Napoleon III was contemplating. When the Austrian foreign minister inquired about this obvious roadblock, Napoleon lied, basically stating that the British didn't wish to publicly back such a plan that would be domestically controversial. Privately, they were all for it. At the end of November of 1861, 10,000 troops of this combined military expedition were on their way to Mexico. When they got to Veracruz, this expeditionary force could do little but occupy the Mexican port and wait. The Juarez government abandoned the area, not wishing to instigate a confrontation. So unsanitary and infested with yellow fever, the British troops refused to even disembark. The force was left in a stalemate, unable, or in the case of the British, unwilling to move into the interior of the country. To get away from the port area, the expeditionary force quickly negotiated an agreement to recognize the Juarez government as legitimate. Knowing that French forces eventually needed to march on Mexico City by themselves, Napoleon III ordered additional troops to Mexico. By April, nothing had been accomplished other than bickering between the three invading imperial entities. It became clear to both the British and Spanish command that the French were intent on not only invasion, but regime change. Both countries negotiated with the Juarez government a suspension of debt repayment and then withdrew from Mexico. The French were now on their own. With about 6,000 men, the French military commander, the Comte de Lorenzay, resolved to begin an invasion into the interior of the country. dismissing the overwhelming numerical superiority of Juarez's 60,000 troops. Following a few minor successful skirmishes, on May 4th, the French force approached the city of Puebla, about 170 miles from the coast. Typically arrogant, on May 5th, 1862, Lawrence ordered a full frontal assault of two heavily armed elevated stone forts that protected the entrance to the city. Despite impressive military formation, the French attackers suffered massive casualties, charging repeatedly into a savage crossfire of muskets and artillery. This attack continued for hours until it was finally called off, the French suffering close to 500 soldiers killed, a tenth of their infantry. A humiliating retreat followed, this resounding defeat still celebrated as a Mexican holiday today as Cinco de Mayo. Surprisingly, Napoleon III ignored this omen of failure by doubling down. He now publicly framed the defeat as an insult to French honor that must be avenged and ordered up another additional 25,000 troops for Mexico. Maximillian he continually reassured, claiming that the withdrawal of Britain especially was a good thing. France and Maximillian no longer constrained by other meddling powers. The Austrian ministers made it quite clear to the Archduke that he should not get involved in this invasion, that if France ever withdrew, he would either be expelled by the U.S. or receive an even harsher fate at the hands of the Mexican Republicans. Unfortunately, Maximilian and Charlotte were too far along in their imperial daydreams to give up so easily. They solicited second opinions from various diplomats and even journalists concerning the viability of a Mexican monarchy, receiving some encouragement. But as 1862 dragged on, there was no military resolution. Maximilian not about to do anything until the French had gained control of the country's capital, Mexico City. With Lawrence having been relieved over the Cinco de Mayo debacle, a new commander, Élie Faure, was given command of the French army in Mexico. But his march on the capital was much more deliberate than his predecessor. When he reached Puebla in March of 1863, he decided that a siege was a more appropriate tactic, an intelligent strategy, but also very time-consuming. 26,000 French troops slowly encircled the city and used artillery bombardments to reduce the outer forts to rubble. It took about 2 months, but on May 19, 1863, a year after the initial French disaster, Puebla surrendered. Benito Juarez then decided to abandon Mexico City, understanding the size and diversity of the country and his ability to drain his invaders of the considerable resources required to finance such an invasion. On June 10th, the French army marched into Mexico City, the route prepared by conservative sympathizers with French and Mexican flags and portraits of Maximilian and Charlotte. By now, Charlotte's name was transformed into Carlotta, an attempt to appeal to the Mexican population. The local citizenry did turn out, over 150,000 inhabitants, and Mexico City, with wide boulevards and classical architecture, resembled any of its sophisticated counterparts. Still, little progress was made with regard to the actual installation of the new regime's emperor. It was not until October 3, 1863, that a formal Mexican delegation, led by José Gutiérrez de Estrada, made its way to Miramar to discuss the situation with Maximilian. Dressed to impress, Maximilian had his staff also dressed in black uniforms with silver embroidery, and giant halberdiers stationed at the entrance to the castle. At precisely 12 noon, the massive doors of the palace were thrown open and the delegation formally admitted, Maximilian waiting to greet them in formal wear, sporting a medal, the Order of the Golden Fleece, an ancient Habsburg decoration. The delegation then sat down to an elaborate dinner, attended by Carlotta as well. Although the Mexicans were impressed, Maximilian remained non-committal, reiterating his demands with regard to British and French guarantees and Mexican popular referendums. During this time period, it became clear that Britain would never even provide diplomatic recognition of a Mexican monarchy. Despite Franz Josef's admonition that Maximilian should not proceed with only French backing, the Archduke remained optimistic. He even began to backpedal on his demand for British support, the rationale that the Civil War would prevent any direct U.S. military intervention. Both Maximilian's brother and mother were openly negative about the entire venture, Franz Josef also going so far as to refuse any official Austrian military support. Napoleon III also began to minimize any real need for any preliminary popular Mexican electoral input, understanding the reality of how little territory the French military actually controlled. He reassured Maximilian that all of that could wait. In Mexico, governing fell to a regency committee comprised of Mexican conservatives who did little other than attempting to reestablish the authority of the Catholic Church. Militarily, Eli Faure relaxed once he reached Mexico City, an attitude that did not sit well with Napoleon III. The emperor solved this problem by promoting Faure to the rank of marshal, the highest rank in the French army, but then recalled him to France on the pretext that he was now too high-ranking for such an out-of-the-way posting as Mexico. The marshal's replacement, Achille Bazin, was also ordered to homogenize the Mexican government into one political party, a party that allowed owners to retain land purchased from property nationalized from the Catholic Church. Bazin also began militarily expanding the imperialist government's sphere of influence in the country, pushing the Juarez government further north, closer to the U.S. border than to Mexico City. These promising military developments prompted Maximilian and Carlotta to come to Paris in March of 1864. Once there, Maximilian began an official negotiation over the terms of his assumption of power. During this process, Napoleon III clearly had the upper hand, having the resources of the entire diplomatic and political sections of the French government, as opposed to the Archduke, who, ignoring his brother's advice to walk away from the position, was on his own with the exception of the counsel of his father-in-law, the King of Belgium. The resulting agreement reflected this massive imbalance of power. Maximilian was compelled to pay the cost of the invasion, dating from 1862 until July of 1864, a sum calculated at 270 million French francs, with 3% interest tacked on. Although a loan was arranged, this money was to remain in France under the control of the French government, and additional costs of financing were added to the accrued charges. Maximilian would be required to make monthly payments from the assets and revenue of the Mexican government, an entity so broke that European governments had resorted to invasion to force previous loan repayment. Essentially, Napoleon III was expanding his international control while forcing another entity to pay for and administer this asset. Failure to meet these obligations permitted Napoleon III to withdraw military support from Maximilian and leave his government effectively on its own. Napoleon assured Maximilian that, of course, he would never consider doing such a thing. Maximilian signed documents officially accepting this royal appointment and the relevant financial obligations. Despite this weighty financial burden, Maximilian returned to Vienna, enthusiastic about the future. His wife also thrilled that as an emperor's wife, she was now the social equal of that of her condescending sister-in-law, Franz Josef's wife Elizabeth. Unfortunately, the Emperor of Austria then issued an ultimatum that certainly diminished any positive outlook and even threatened to scuttle the entire venture. He insisted that Maximilian, in writing, officially renounce any inheritance and claim to the Austrian throne, and even renounce his official Austrian financial interests. Maximilian angrily refused, and also pointedly told his brother that he would notify Napoleon III that he was renouncing the Mexican throne because of this last-minute, humiliating ultimatum. This would have serious diplomatic and possibly even military consequences. Napoleon III summoning the Austrian ambassador and all but threatening him with a military response if Maximilian backed out of the deal. Although Maximilian had extended conversations about the possibility of certain scenarios to avoid losing his Austrian imperial status, Franz Josef remained adamant. He did relax some of the personal financial demands upon his brother, but Maximilian, to become Emperor of Mexico, would have to renounce any claim to the Austrian throne. It was one or the other. Maximilian then informed Napoleon III that such a condition was intolerable and that he intended to inform the Mexican delegation waiting patiently in the vicinity of Trieste, officially of his position. Napoleon III then resorted to appealing to Maximilian's honor, pointing out that he, as a gentleman, was no longer really in a position to renege on a legally signed agreement. During the week of April 8, 1864, Maximilian vacillated. Finally, he decided to accept Napoleon III's offer and renounce any claim to the Austrian throne. On April 9th, Franz Josef personally journeyed to Miramar, presenting his brother with the paperwork to officially guarantee this outcome. Behind closed doors, heated arguments transpired for much of the day, till the emperor finally emerged with signed documents. He immediately left the palace and took a train back to Vienna. The following day, Maximilian met with the Mexican delegation and officially accepted the position of emperor. Both he and Carlotta intended to leave for Mexico immediately, but after the tension of the previous week and another exhausting day of diplomatic affairs and document review, he was too exhausted to even consider such a journey. It would be 4 days before Maximilian was ready for his transatlantic voyage. He would travel on the Novara, a steam frigate built during his tenure as head of the Austrian Navy. Escorted by a French warship, there were stops in Rome and Gibraltar before heading for the Americas. Although this was the culmination of a 3-year process, and his wife was outwardly jubilant over the impending adventure, Maximilian was clearly overcome with both the enormity of the challenges he faced and what he was leaving behind. The only acknowledgement of his departure from his family was a telegram from his parents wishing him well, but acknowledging that they might not ever see him again. For much of the 6-week oceanic trip, Maximilian remained isolated in his cabin, utterly depressed. The Novara arrived in the vicinity of Veracruz on May 28, 1864. The port was relatively empty, residents not particularly excited about the imperial arrival, and military and political figures not exactly thrilled with the prospect of spending time in a port area that was rife with yellow fever. Proceeding in their own personal carriage, the emperor and empress made their way through mostly empty streets and then proceeded in the direction of Mexico City. Although they stopped at several towns along the route, partaking in local banquets and celebrations, they were shocked by the relative squalor of the countryside, even the poorest Austrian village relatively prosperous by comparison. However, again, the much more civilized atmosphere and impressive architecture of the capital and the enthusiastically large crowd which greeted them with repeated shouts of "Viva el Emperador" improved their outlook. June 12, 1864 was the first day of their official residence as Emperor and Empress of Mexico. Despite the resentment of some Mexican Republicans over the cost of the pageantry surrounding this installation, including the subsequent official balls and banquets, this initial process was a successful attempt to ingratiate the new rulers with every sector of the population, including Catholics and the poor indigenous. Maximilian himself was intent on constructing the type of constitutional monarchy that his brother would have never permitted in Austria. Unfortunately, the newly minted emperor retained some of the aspects of the antiquated concepts that came with monarchy, especially his obsession with court etiquette, attempting to impose a system of European behavior in a society and government in which such behavior was non-existent. Still, with his Mexican advisor Almonte and military leader Bazaine, Maximilian and the concept of imperial rule remained popular in the capital. Unfortunately, Mexico was a country that possessed a great deal of territory, with only a central portion and the capital fully controlled by the French military. It also was typified by a weak government and chaotic administration marked by minimal financing and a large amount of foreign long-term debt, a situation that was worsening by the day especially under the deal struck with Napoleon III. Although Maximilian fully understood these fundamental challenges, developing immediate solutions was unrealistic. He also behaved in an entitled manner typical of a Western European autocrat, spending lavishly on official residences like Chapultepec Castle, the National Palace, possibly appropriate for a mere politician, but not up to the standards of a royal residence. Although Maximilian personally was bored by such events, Carlotta was intent on both creating and socializing within a court society, lavish balls and dinners sponsored on a frequent and repetitive basis. Only the finest meals and wines were served at these events, which frequently resulted in lengthy drunken bacchanals. The imperial couple also brought their own entourage of servants, valets, footmen, and ladies-in-waiting, hundreds in all, these individuals on the government payroll. Maximilian paid himself about $125,000 monthly. The official salary of the Mexican president had been about $30,000 annually. Having established his living and social environment, Maximilian then got down to the business of staffing a government and cabinet. Although the emperor was mindful enough to include several moderate Mexicans in positions of influence, including that of foreign minister, his inner circle of advisors were comprised of French, Belgian, Austrian, and even a Hungarian personal secretary who insisted upon a gatekeeping role in which access to the emperor was frequently impeded. Because these individuals did not speak Spanish, documents frequently needed translation, and this group was completely unfamiliar with both Mexico or even governmental administration. While this haphazard apparatus did not bode well for long-term government stability, at least initially, the military performance under the new regime was able to effectively push Juarez and the Republicans into geographic insignificance. By mid-1864, French forces occupied Matamoros, effectively controlling every port town on the Gulf of Mexico. Juarez's army was down to about 15,000 men, politicians, officers, and soldiers deserting in droves, and the combined French expeditionary force numbering almost 3 times that number. In spite of all the challenges he faced, Maximilian remained quite positive, constantly communicating by letter with Napoleon III, reassuring him that he and his reign were quite popular, possibly to escape some of the negative aspects of governance, including how exactly he should address the government's fundamental financial dilemma. In early August, the emperor announced that he would embark on a 3-month tour of his domain, incorporating aspects of the celebrations of Mexico's September 16th Independence Day. This undertaking was the 19th century version of a political public relations spectacle, an attempt to unite both conservative monarchists and formerly liberal Republicans. In several public speeches during this tour, he expounded on liberal ideas and even appeared dressed in simple Mexican clothing. In his absence, however, the central government remained paralyzed, and some of Napoleon III's covert eyes and ears in the government reported back that little was being done to organize and improve government finances. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Maximilian I. Information for this podcast came from the books The Last Emperor of Mexico by Edward Shawcross and Maximilian and Carlotta, Europe's Last Empire in Mexico by M.M. McAllen. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.